Hey there, do you need to paint 100 units fast? I don't. I'm not crazy enough to actually paint 20 Tyranids in a row, let alone 100. It's just not what I do. But if I did, this is all I would actually use. Starting off with grabbing my sponge and dipping in some water, rinsing it with my fingers, and grabbing some AK wine red. For the color scheme, I decided to go with Behemoth for no reason other than just they look awesome and they also kind of remind me of Venom, which is a big plus. The one thing I definitely wanted to avoid with this color scheme for Behemoth is they're usually painted with their carapace being blue, and I don't like the way that looks at all. So I decided to skip that step entirely, and in the concept of painting an army very fast, this will be even more helpful. You could also technically say that this is now also some alternative Hive Fleet if you wanted, because it's not adhering to the classical color scheme. Given that Hive Fleet Behemoth is technically defeated and extinct, or you could essentially say that this is now Hive Fleet Venom, some alternative version that, you know, is even deadlier because they lack the color blue. For this, I also decided to include the entire painting process as the Tyranid was very fast, minus a few mishaps where essentially my camera just randomly cut out because of the battery issues. Now, the obvious question is going to be, what kind of a sponge is it? It's called a synthetic art sponge. You can probably find them in art stores, and I personally get ones that come in this donut shape, well, without the hole. For the next step, I grabbed a paper towel and essentially expelled some of the moisture, and then grabbing 1 dot of wine red, 1 dot of cadmium orange, and mixing them together in the exact same mix using the exact same sponge to apply it over the model. The paint is still wet as I didn't feel like waiting for at least the first layer to dry, so I just continued moving on straight on. This time I am trying to cover a little bit less area, and I'm also expelling a lot more paint than previously because the sponge is a lot more dry, so there's actually a lot more paint rather than just paint and water. An incredibly important part is I'm not concerned at all about the times where my sponge sometimes goes in the carapace. If you're painting 100 units or 40 or 20, doesn't matter. If you're painting a large amount of these just base units, it doesn't matter. Try to go over it if you can. If you don't, it's fine. Then I grabbed my dry brush and went over the exact same color as previous, making sure that the paint by this point was actually dry. Even though I'm using the exact same paint, because it's dry and because it's essentially going on in its pure form rather than just being diluted with water, it'll look much brighter. And in this case, it'll also create a much smoother transition for the next hot color. For those wondering, by the way, this dry brush is just a makeup brush from a dollar store. It was literally $1, so it doesn't have any value, and by this point, like once it paints like 20-30 units, you can just throw it out and not worry about the fact that you might have ruined it. And the weird contraption you saw me using, if you didn't see my previous short, it's essentially a dry brush palette that really helps out with seeing how your dry brush is going to go on. Then I mixed up some white into our previous mix and added 1 dot of orange to essentially, first we made it brighter, and then using the orange, we also warmed it up once again. And I'm using the dry brush palette just to make sure that my paint has the perfect consistency. And this is essentially our final highlight. This is what's going to give the model a lot more depth to essentially the previous dark colors that we created. Even though we were using a lot of the exact same colors, a lot of the bright colors, very saturated reds, because we're going over black and because it has so much water in it, it was very dark. So now we're bringing out all the details, and I wasn't sure in the beginning if I wanted to go over the carapace, but I just grabbed a little bit more and I just decided to just, you know what? It's fast. It's meant to be fast. So I'm just going to go against the grain of the carapace and create this very bright, saturated highlight. I considered, once again, it's the classic mindset of, oh, let me just add this color. Oh, let me just add this color. But if you are painting an army, I wanted to focus my mind entirely of that. I imagined I have 99 of these dudes that I got to paint, so I don't want to add any more color. I want to have as simple of a step process as possible, essentially, to just make sure I actually paint them. So I said, you know what? We're going to have just some of this like red highlighted carapace. Why not? Then I took some Vallejo Emerald Green and just applied it over the model. This is actually one of the processes where it cut out roughly, but I decided to show it again and just went over the exact same color. You don't have to do this. It's not going to add any extra saturation or anything like that because this color is very powerful. Then I just added a little bit of white, just to a tiny small of emerald green, and added a little bit more. And this gives you this really nice turquoise color, and I went over to bring some of this highlight. I would say this is actually worth doing because we have very limited colors already on our miniature, so by giving this very bright, contrasting color to the red, it'll make the miniatures look a lot more awesome on the tabletop. Personally, when I paint like a large amount of units and I'm using very simple steps and I know the model is not going to have a lot of detail and I'm just painting it for the tabletop, I want there to be very large contrast between the colors because it'll help create an effect that I actually did more than I technically did. This is where I decided to experiment with some speed paint Grim Black. I didn't have a wash at a typical acrylic wash, and I know if you're speed painting, you don't want to use an enamel, that'll take ages. So I grabbed some Flow Aid, I applied it, you know, I would say like it's 3-to-1 to the speed paint and mixed it together. This was a leap of faith. I had no idea if this was going to work. I hoped it was going to create a very nice wash effect because I did use the speed paint before and it worked awesome. So it was literally just me hoping that it'll work. And I'll be honest, it turned out fantastic. I think this will actually be an acrylic wash I'll be using from now on. It had this very awesome effect of just making the model a lot darker, but at the same time, it did not dull the color as much as I thought a typical acrylic wash would, so I was very happy with the result. The only downside of this step was the fact that because I used Flow Improver, it did make the entire model a lot more shiny, literally just glossy, which is part of what makes Flow Improver is to make it flow in the model much better. There's essentially a little bit of it's not really a gloss varnish, but it's a very similar effect that once it dries, it'll look very glossy. And I'll be honest, I liked it so much, I didn't even varnish the model. I just decided to keep the natural like leathery look that it provided. It just made the model look a lot more insect Tyranid and organic. And then here I just cleaned out my brush and just made sure that I took some of the speed paint out of the eyes and a lot of the sockets were just a little bit too much pulled together. For the base, I just decided to do the simple thing that I always do. I grabbed some AK Dark Mud and just applied it all over the base. Once it was dry, I grabbed the cheapest tuff that I have that was green. It's the brightest green. I never use these, but in the context of this red Tyranid, green is the perfect color, and this just looked awesome. And we were done. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. I'll do my best to answer all of them. Hey, and if you enjoyed the video, consider maybe subscribing, liking, disliking. That's all up to you. All of it helps. Thanks.